Tanji, the University Librarian at UCI. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of the UCI Humanities Center's year-long program called Encountering Oceans, Explorations of Space, Time, and the Human. So today's event features an exciting panel of speakers and the debut of a virtual library display on oceans, which complements this program. And we're going to begin this evening's program with a dedication from Angela Mooney DRC, from the Acjachemen Nation, Waneno Band of Mission Indians. Angela is the Executive Director and founder of Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples. This is a grassroots, Indigenous-led environmental justice organization dedicated to building the capacity of Native nations and Indigenous peoples to protect sacred lands, waters, and cultures. Angela has been working with Native nations, Indigenous peoples, grassroots and nonprofit organizations, artists, educators, and institutions on environmental and cultural justice issues for 20 years. So please join me in welcoming Angela Mooney, DRC.
Hello, everyone. My name is Angela Mooney, DRC. I am Acjachemen, so Orange County, where University of California, Irvine is located, is within the shared ancestral homelands of the Acjachemen and Fangba people. It's a real honor to be invited to open this up, and I want to start first by just saying that Black lives absolutely matter on Acjachemen homeland. So I think it's really important to bring these moments together, because often indigeneity is disaggregated and segregated from the lived experience of other Indigenous folks who are removed from their homelands further in time and place. And that absolutely centers around the ocean. I really appreciate what this conversation and what this year is supposed to be doing. And I'd just like to add to the description in terms of what exploration folks are going to be considering, specifically the question, how have colonization and the doctrine of discovery altered human relationships with oceans and places? Because I think ultimately you can understand colonization as first and foremost a severing of relationships of people to one another, of people to place, to land, to water, to culture, to food, to stories and songs. And so I think that when we think of the oceans in this context, and understanding the global impact of colonization and doctrine of discovery, I think that's a good frame to go with when we're talking about the ways in which different people of color and Indigenous folks experience white supremacist settler colonial culture today. And finally, I just want to say that decolonization then is a process of repairing and restoring relationships. And so I am excited about this endeavor that UCI is taking on this year, because I think that we often don't think as big as the ocean, right? And so the opportunity to think about human and non-human relationships with place in this broader context is really important. So welcome virtually and digitally to my homelands in the shared territory of Acjachemen and Fangba people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for your important remarks and words of welcome. As mentioned earlier, this event is the start of a year-long program by the UCI Humanities Center called Encountering Oceans, Exploration of Space, Time, and the Human. The topic of oceans is certainly an intriguing one. We'll be hearing from speakers how it impacts and has a wide-ranging impact across time and cultures. And I will say that when the library was contacted to do a display, we were so excited by the opportunity. It melded so well with the library's role in serving students and faculty across all fields, and the way that we try to promote intellectual growth and creativity through our collections and our services. And so in fact, you could say that the library provides an ocean of cross-disciplinary information resources for you to explore. And for that reason, the library really values being a part of this program, and I'd like to give a special thanks and shout out to the director of the UCI Humanities Center and Chancellor's Fellow, Professor Judy Wu. Now, this year-long exploration of oceans would not be possible without Aaron Kotzman, a third-year PhD student in visual studies at UCI. He's working with the Humanities Center as a graduate student researcher on this Oceans Initiative this academic year. And the UCI Libraries virtual display is curated by Research Librarian for Humanities and Literature, Richard Cho. And the display, Richard highlights the complex and multifaceted themes that oceans play in our lives through books. And so the virtual display or exhibit is organized into the following categories for exploration: thinking oceans, the Black Atlantic, the Caribbean, Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the ocean and the Anthropocene, and the Mediterranean. And so by clicking on each category at the top, the user can view ebooks curated for each of these themes. And so current UCI students, faculty, and staff can actually access the ebooks directly from this with their UCI Net ID. So I invite you to visit this virtual display. You can find it at the Oceans Project URL that is at the bottom of this slide. And now tonight's panel of esteemed speakers will be moderated by a strategic university leader who is also a well-known humanities researcher and scholar. Please join me in welcoming the UCI School of Humanities Dean, Professor Tyrus Miller.
Thank you, Lorelei. I wanted to start by thanking Lorelei and the library for this wonderful partnership. And she mentioned Judy Wu. I also want to mention our Humanities Center, which is a recently instituted organization that Judy started as the founding director of last year. And along with being an important hub and supporter of humanities research in the school, and also as a coordinator of a variety of research centers and clusters. I'll mention Lyle, who is part of the early cultures group, and Alex, who directs the Latin American Studies Center. They have a connection with the Humanities Center, but the Humanities Center also has a function over and above those other two very important functions, which is also in projecting the humanities into the larger public discussions, the conversations that matter that we have about issues like the oceans or our current elections, many other topics. So last year, the Humanities Center coordinated a whole set of thematically organized events around the issues of borders and belongings. This year around oceans, and really seeking to trigger broad discussion across units, across disciplines, and also reaching out into different public spheres where these questions really matter. And I want to thank Judy for really conceptualizing this and helping to catalyze some of our partnerships like the event that you're here for today. We have a distinguished group of panelists today, 4 panelists, and I'm going to introduce them just alphabetically, so no hierarchy entailed here. Alex Barucki is an associate professor of history and director of the Latin American Studies Center at UCI. He's the author of From Shipmates to Soldiers, Emerging Black Identities in the Rio de la Plata, and co-editor of From the Galleons to the Highlands, Slave Trade Routes in the Spanish Americas. He's published articles on the African diaspora in journals such as the American Historical Review, Hispanic American Historical Review, Colonial Latin American Review, and many others. I actually first heard of Alex before I came to UCI because of a partnership that he had with a historian at my previous institution, which was UC Santa Cruz, Greg O'Malley. He's the co-creator of the remarkable Intra-American Slave Trade Database. And the data set shows more than 11,000 slave voyages within the Americas and constitutes the first effort at consolidating information about the myriad shipments that forcibly moved enslaved people from one location in the Americas to another. Our second speaker, who I'm meeting today for the first time, Anith Kaur Hundal. She's an assistant professor of anthropology and the Don Kaur Sahota Presidential Chair of Sikh Studies at UC Irvine. She's currently completing a book project called Insecurities of Expulsion, Afro-Asian Citizenship Formation and Global Uganda, that explores Afro-Asian relationalities and citizenship practices in the post-Asian expulsion exodus context of East Africa. She's also beginning 2 projects on Sikh feminist thought and Sikh histories in California and the UC system. So welcome to our panel, Anith. David Igler is professor of history and has taught at UCI since 2003. He's published widely in the fields of environmental history and the American West, while more recently his research interests have turned to the Pacific Ocean. His latest monograph is The Great Ocean, Pacific Worlds from Captain Cook to the Gold Rush. He's currently writing a book that examines the scientific, artistic, and literary productions of Pacific voyages in the early 1800s. And finally, Lyle Massey. Professor Lyle Massey is a historian of early modern Italian and French art with research interests that span the historical divide between the Renaissance and Baroque. Much of her work to date has been concerned with the subtle relationship between art and science in the 15th through the 17th century. She's written on the geometry of linear perspective, on anamorphic perspective, and on Renaissance and Baroque anatomical representations, and she has strong interest in the history of collection and the origins of artistic academies in Italy and France. She's also concerned with articulating how the body, or the concept of embodiment more generally, entered into practices of representation between about 1550 and 1800. What did it mean for an early modern viewer to see a painting as an extension of his or her space? How was the body understood, both as a subject of representation and as a point of origin for representation? And as I say, she directs the early cultures group in the School of Humanities. The courses that Dr. Massey teach range from general introductions to Italian Renaissance and Baroque art to specialized courses on feminist and gender studies as they relate to the study of the Renaissance and of early modern art and of the histories of academies and of collecting. So we have a wonderful panel. I'll just say 30 seconds more about our format. We've asked each of the speakers to give us about 5 minutes relating to the oceans theme, how they see their work connecting with the issues and the theme of oceans. And we will go then to some questioning. Either I may pose a question, or if we have questions really coming in immediately from the audience, we'll go ahead and go right to audience questions. So unless there's any desire on the part of the panelists to depart from the order of introduction, I will start with Alex and have us go in that order.
Thank you very much, Tyrus, for your introductions, and thank you for all the people participated in this initiative. From my part, from my specialization, the study of Atlantic history, of how people living in Europe, in the Americas, and in Africa have interacted with each other during the past 500 years, usually identifies 3 factors, 3 issues in these connections. These are the exchanges of people, commodities, and ideas among these continents. The history of the Atlantic was also a global process that shaped and was shaped as well by much larger developments taking place outside of the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean as well. Take the history of the transatlantic slave trade from the 16th to the 19th centuries, which is my area of specialization. This was a horrific forced shipping of 12 million captive African men, women, and children by merchants and mariners from Europe and the Americas, who eventually landed these Africans in all of the Americas. This was the largest forced migration across continents in world history. But this traffic was also intrinsically connected with the exchange of commodities. So it was not just about people, but also about commodities. And it was integral. It was part of the emergence of modern capitalism in a global scale, not just in the Atlantic Ocean, but beyond that. This traffic also shaped the intellectual history of the Americas, Europe and Africa as well, the exchange of ideas. The unequal exchanges of ideas among people of all these continents influenced the creation and recreation of religious beliefs in all of the Atlantic Basin. And these unequal exchanges also shape the creation and recreation of ideas of self and otherness, of categories of understanding of who we are and who are the others. Talking about categories of identity, and this is my closing part, perhaps one of the most surprising aspects of the 1619 commemorations that we saw last year, and that we will explore this fall quarter through the Humanities Center's programming, is that few people realize that the earliest known slave voyage to sail directly from Africa, embarking captives in Africa, to disembark them in the Americas, landed 500 years ago in Puerto Rico, a Spanish colony that eventually became an incorporated territory of the United States in 1898. The ship Santa Maria de la Luz, or Our Lady of the Light, if my English translation goes well, embarked captive Africans, most probably in the port of Arguin, located in today's country of Mauritania, and disembarked these captives on November 15, 1520, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, 500 years ago. Of course, this shows how the Spanish colonization of the Americas sparked the creation of the transatlantic slave trade. But also, in connection with the 1619 commemorations, this led us to ask those commemorations, what is the United States and what is not, when examining particularly the Puerto Rican aspects of this story. And with this, I'm going to conclude over here. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Alex. We'll turn to Anith now.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for the generous introductions and for this exciting event. I will be talking about the Indian Ocean world. It's a very exciting and growing field as new perspectives, research methodologies, disciplinary and theoretical orientations are building on existing primarily historical scholarship on the Indian Ocean. Historians of the Indian Ocean have emphasized the longue durée social, cultural, religious, political, and economic interactions among Indians, Arabs, and Africans via the medium of Dhow cultures and mercantile trade and commerce in the Indian Ocean. This scholarship examines an alternative world system that existed before the onset of European imperialism and the establishment of colonial polities, modern industrial capitalism and plantation societies, modern conceptions of race, and really the dominance of the liberal, secular, national, the kind of world that we live in now. In his book, 100 Horizons, Indian Ocean and the Age of Empire, Sugata Bose suggests that this world system was a well-integrated region of economic and cultural exchange and interaction that extended pretty much during the, across the ocean during the millennium that stretched from the 8th to the 18th century. With the onset of British Empire in the Indian Ocean realm, the development of the British Raj of India is now beginning to be understood as a sub-imperial presence in the wider Indian Ocean realm, and that's the work of Thomas Metcalfe in his book, Imperial Connections, India and the Indian Ocean World, that I'm referring to. So we think about the Indian Ocean really as a kind of interregional area that is between the larger world system and particular regional formations like nation states. And I want to suggest that area studies frameworks in the Western Academy are relatively modern, and recent constructions that project forms of colonial power onto knowledge production. We generally operate within binaries of the West and the non-West, the North and the South, empire and nation state. But what if we shift our gaze to other subregions for analysis? What becomes legible, and why is this legibility important? I think casting our gaze to the Indian Ocean world provides a sense of depth in time and space, such that we can think of the ocean as a field of meaning, a contact zone tied together by different kinds of political, economic, religious, cultural, environmental, ecological formations. The Indian Ocean perhaps yields possibilities for thinking beyond and past the violence of colonial and national territorialization or neoliberal capitalist empire that we currently are contending with today. And it allows us to think about the endurance of these older historical formations, that they still possibly exist today. And so in that vein, there's new research on maritime economies and cultures, oceanic forms of sovereignty, non-secular religious universalisms, human environment interactions, and really a questioning of the fixed nature of racial and ethnic identity. And I think that it's a critical contact zone for that enables a kind of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary form of thinking. In my own book project that I'm just completing, I found that it was really difficult to make my work legible. I was constrained by area studies formations of African studies and South Asian diaspora studies, and also methodological nationalisms in general. And it made it very difficult to kind of trace the circulations, ideas, mobilities of people across South Asia, the Indian Ocean, and East Africa. And so my book ultimately critically engages with some of the earlier nationalist scholarship and ends up arguing for a stronger field formation on global South, Afro-Asian, Indian Ocean formations. I think this is really important as we're continuing to see changes in our world system. We're talking about the emergence of a multipolar world. We're talking about the kind of demise of existing empires and perhaps the emergence of new empires. Where will the Indian Ocean fit in all of this, I think, is a really interesting question to ask. I'm just going to end really briefly in my capacity as in building 6 studies here at UCI. I wanted to talk about the fact that there's emerging work on 6 in the Indian Ocean world. The Indian Ocean scholarship primarily has focused on Islamic universalisms that span India, the Persian Gulf, and Africa. But Sikhism is actually a newer spiritual tradition that was founded in the 15th century. So there's sort of less work on the role of Sikhs in the Indian Ocean world. I traced the movement of Sikh communities within the British imperial context of the Indian Ocean world. I'm interested in this kind of imperial diaspora of Sikhs, particularly because the British defined Sikh communities as martial races, and they were recruited within imperial and colonial labor regimes, particularly as indentured labor or within the police and the military. And so I think about Sikh communities and the Sikh tradition as something that's profoundly global and part of the making of our kind of global modern world. I'm interested in structural complicities with empire, old and new, but I'm also interested in the kinds of grounded intimacies and solidarities that are formed across ideas of civilizational, cultural, religious, and racial difference between, for example, Punjabi Sikh and African communities, African descendant communities. One example would be the role of the Sikh community in the Ghadar Party movement. This was a global British anti-colonial movement which was spearheaded by primarily working class Punjabi Sikhs in North America, in East Africa, and India. And I'm interested in these kind of radical left formations that were multiracial, multi-religious, at times secular, but at times grounded in notions of the divine. And I'm interested in thinking about what kinds of political formations have emerged within this, the Indian Ocean world, but also the kind of imperial legacies of the Indian Ocean world that we still live within. So I'll just end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anit. David?
Yes. So I want to reflect a bit on the program that we have this year, marvelously put together by the Humanities Center. But before I do, I just want to refer back to Aneeth and what Angela also said. Aneeth's statement there was simply marvelous in terms of sort of you describing an agenda of the new oceanic studies that I think is really important in terms of countering area studies and embracing, you know, issues of intersectionality and colonialism and so on and so forth. So what you said really resonated. I taught a graduate course on world oceans last quarter, and I wish I had that. I wish I had you come into our class to sort of offer that perspective. So thank you for that. And Angela Mooney Darcy, you know, what the sort of a key point that she made there about the global impact of colonization really rings true, in the sense that in the past, historians at least have sort of treated the global impact of colonization through sort of land-based terrestrial histories, and what we are offering in terms of oceanic studies is really a different framework in which to understand colonization and issues of empire. So I really appreciated what Angela Mooney Darcy said as well. My own work on the Pacific sort of emerged out of earlier studies I'd done on the American West, a field that I got, I think it's safe to say, a bit bored with. And I found the challenge of working on the Pacific to be really great and really exciting. The literature that I encountered 20 years ago, it was very well developed, very deep, and very interdisciplinary in terms of historical, anthropological, ethnographic, indigenous studies, visual studies in the Pacific. And I think what we've seen in the past 2 decades has been just a fluorescence of new literature within this field. I mention that in part because the library exhibit that we saw, very brief example of, demonstrates the work, fairly recent work that's been done on the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, comparative oceans, so on and so forth. And that work is also spread across so many different methodologies and fields of study. Again, it can be historical, it can be natural sciences, earth sciences, anthropology, so on and so forth. And so in the library exhibit, and I really hope you all take a look at the books that are to be offered, you know, we see this fluorescence of the past generation of scholarship on world oceans. But what we also see there are some of the foundational studies that go back 50, 60, 75 years. I was really excited to see Rachel Carson's book, The Sea Around Us. And Rachel Carson published The Sea Around Us 15 years before she published Silent Spring. And this is a book I can only encourage all of you to read. It is beautifully written, it is lyrical, and it is such a sort of almost deep philosophical approach to thinking about the oceans from what today we would say is an environmental perspective. So I want to acknowledge that part of the library exhibit as part of this year-long thematic planning around topics with oceans. Another really key part is relates back to Alex Baruchi's work, and on the library website you'll find the link to slavevoyages.org. And slavevoyages.org, in my mind, is simply a phenomenal, not only database, but portal into the world centuries ago of the transatlantic and inter-American slave trade. I have both my undergraduates and my graduate students go into the into slavevoyages.org and do projects there. And I think what Alex and all of his colleagues who have contributed to this effort have done is really important work that will be used for decades and decades to come. Finally, I want to acknowledge Judy Wu in terms of putting together the oceans theme for this year. She and other people could not have picked a more appropriate theme for the fall. The 1619 project that many of us are teaching in our classes, both graduate and undergraduate classes. And it is, of course, now being challenged in the public political sphere as a certain type of scholarship. And I think we have very important work to do in terms of expressing what we see in the 1619 project and supporting its authors in every way that we can. In the winter quarter, we go forward to look at the Pacific Ocean, the Black Pacific, and the Indigenous Pacific. And I'm very much looking forward to that set of workshops and lectures and what have you. And many of us will again be bringing our undergraduates as well as our graduate students into that programming. So Judy, hats off to you and everybody who has been a major contributor to this programming for this year. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, David. And Lyle?
Yes, so I want to back up David on that Judy's done a fantastic job and that this first sort of quarter is filled with some of the most important things that we could actually deal with in this coming year in an election season, in which all of those issues about whose history is actually represented are front and forward all the time. And I want to thank Judy also and Lorelei for putting together the terrific exhibition of books in the library or through the library's website. And also say that I'm a little bit of an interloper here. I mean, I'm here in my capacity as the director for the Center of Early Cultures, and I wanted to put a plug in for some of the things that are actually coming after the 1619 project, at the same time as urge everybody to attend as much as they can because of the fantastic array of events that Judy and the Humanities Center have put together. But the Center for Early Cultures is also basically mounting in winter quarter a 2-day symposium called Sea Sense, and we're incredibly excited that our keynote speakers will be on one day, Jeffrey Cohen, who's Dean of Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University and co-president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, with his partner, Julian Yates, who's a professor of English and Material Cultural Studies at University of Delaware. They are actually co-presenting a project they've been working on for a while, basically is on Noah's Ark and the kind of the ways in which, Noah's Ark basically as a story, it resonates and actually involves a certain perception of catastrophe and the environment over the longue durée in European literature and history and religion. And then the other day, we actually are incredibly delighted that we get to host Steve Mentz, who is actually a professor of English at St. John's University in Queens, New York. And he is, in fact, the person who coined the term blue humanities and has produced like a prodigious amount of work on the oceans, including a book which is featured in the online exhibition for the library, and it's just called Oceans. It's a Bloomsbury Press book. And I think, in that book, in a lot of ways, Steve Mentz brings together a whole host of different kinds of perspectives on the study of oceans, invoking sort of multiple histories, poetry, theoretical thinking, queer couplings, exaltations, and immersive practices. So this is something we're very excited about. And this is going to actually take place April 29 and 30, probably as a virtual conference. The other thing I want to say is that I am actually, fortuitously, when Judy decided she wanted this year to be on oceans, it happened that I personally was involved with an international colloquium of scholars, interdisciplinary scholars, who are focused on 3 years of studying environmental humanities in the early modern period. And it happened that last year, the first year was sort of focused on the concept of earth. And this year happens to be focused on sea. And as a result of that, we're actually, the first one was in Oxford. The second one is actually going to be here in California at Bodega Bay, UC Davis's marine laboratory up at Bodega Bay. And most of that, the conference will be in June that we're sort of planning. We've got a UC Humanities Research Institute grant for a multi-campus working group. And we're heading towards this to sort of think about the coast, Francis Drake's landing, or whether he did or didn't land, whether or not that's actually kind of a figment of somebody's imagination earlier in the 20th century, but about the sort of idea about, the confrontation on the California coast between indigeneity and sort of the sea. And what comes from the sea in terms of colonialization. So just very briefly, I'm going to go and just show a couple of things. I am an art historian. And Ryan, if we could actually just go to the slides that I brought in. I wanted to sort of show this in part because I thought it was great, Anita, sort of talking about the Indian Ocean. I wanted to sort of say, I, as a Europeanist, right, the Mediterranean is the focus of many of the kinds of studies that I have read. And that really starts with Fernand Braudel's great sort of monumental study of the Mediterranean that's dated to 1949 is when it was actually first published. And although the Mediterranean is a very problematic area, Mediterranean studies perhaps doesn't have quite the resonance that it used to, that book was in fact a kind of watershed book because of the way in which Fernand Braudel approached the study of the Mediterranean. And he did it in the age of Philip II. So it's basically against the background of the sort of age of colonial expansion. And it's he was one of the sort of earliest proponents of social history. He was also, though, the first to, with that in mind, to examine how the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, connected, distinct regions, and then examine them geohistorically using a kind of comparativist approach, but with a kind of multi-dimensional perspective and a shifting time scale. So he goes from like the longue durée to microhistories and is attempting in some senses was attempting to break down the artificial boundaries between things like East and West in the Mediterranean. And also to a certain extent trying to grapple with the kind of history of Islam and Christendom. Now there's, since 1949, so much work has actually been done. He clearly himself had no familiarity really, or not good familiarity with the Ottoman Empire or with Ottoman history. So he was really sort of handicapped in a lot of ways. But he did kind of note that after 1580, Philip II turned his attention away from the Mediterranean and shifted his attention to Portugal, to the Atlantic and the Netherlands. So 1580 is the kind of watershed year for him. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of say is that in that sort of the history of the Mediterranean, I actually wanted to show some images as an art historian, because I think images can show really the weirdness with which Europeans approach the concept of the oceans, or sort of see them in this kind of mutable arena of meaning here. And so I just brought in some of the crazier images that I could find, figuring that they would always be interesting to look at. And the first is Ophiuchus de Canastris, this manuscript over here, a page from a manuscript. Ophiuchus was a kind of a low functionary in the papal court in Avignon in the 14th century, who had a breakdown, but was ill for a couple of years. And when it came out, he started having visions, and he was sort of tolerated by the court. He started just basically drawing and painting. And he was fascinated with portolan charts maps, which are the sailors' maps that chart coastlines. And so what we are seeing here is one of his visions of Europe and Africa with this, through the kind of lens of a portolan chart. And there's no way to describe this other than that it is an image that absolutely sort of conflicts with everything we think of when we think about something like the conceptualization of oceans through mapping. So what we have here is, this is Europe, and you can actually see Europe is in the shape of a man, and one of his legs is the boot of Italy here. Across the Mediterranean is Africa in the shape of a woman. Her hands right here basically mark Tunisia, and her feet are in Egypt. And in the meantime, the ocean is red, or the sea is red, and the sea is conceptualized as Lucifer, who is actually consuming the figure of Europe. This is, these are actually, basically visions that this particular individual is having, but I think they also point to this idea of the embodiment of continents and the embodiment of seas, which is a special kind of issue when you want to talk about something like the iconography of oceans in this period. And then up here is a print, a beautiful hand-tinted print by a Dutch artist named Adrian Collart, which is an allegory of water that fits in with a kind of Aristotelian view of the elements, but also you can see water spurting from her breast. It's about fecundity, and it brings back sort of allusions to things like Venus on the half shell being born from the waves itself. And then the last image that I brought in was this one, Giorgio Vasari's Perseus and Andromeda, which is actually a painting that was in the little studiolo of Francesco de' Medici in Florence, which was a collection, an early, we might say an early museum. And this painting was supposed to is actually about the origins of coral, which is actually told through the story of Perseus and Andromeda. Perseus cuts off the head of Medusa, then he goes to rescue Andromeda. The blood that spurts out of the head of Medusa goes into the water and becomes coral. And coral was a substance that was thought to actually have very specific kinds of properties in the in alchemy. So it's a precious substance, but it's also a substance that's seen as something that's produced by the transformative nature of the sea itself. So I just brought these in basically to be kind of provocative, and I'm sure that someone will ask some question I can't answer about all of them or one of them. But anyway, I thought it was sort of instructive to think about the fact that the seas are not this kind of monolithic idea that is actually ahistorical, right? That in fact, the seas take on completely, and the ocean takes on completely different meanings, in different places at different times.
I want to thank all of our panelists, and actually, Lyle, your bringing up of the sort of improbable conjunction of Noah's Ark and Ferdinand Brodel actually leads very well into our first question, and that is, and this is for any or each of the panelists. The question is, what kind of place do you reserve for the non-human in your study of the ocean? And I think that refers to the animal world, to other aspects of non-human life, as well as those kinds of materialities and environmental aspects that Brodel was also looking at so powerfully. So any of the panelists, if you'd like to come in on that question of the non-human. David?
Yeah, I just say you know, wearing my hat as an environmental historian, the non-human is absolutely central to studying either land-based histories or ocean-based histories. And so, you know, kind of more specifically, my work on the Pacific is constantly concerned with issues of people moving across space that is, you know, sort of natural environment conditioned by currents and winds and waves and all that sort of stuff. And with, you know, present day issues of global warming, that is only more sort of imperative to think about the ways that we frame our histories as interactions between humans and the natural environment. And in the book I published some years ago, I spent a great deal of time, possibly too much time, with marine mammals, specifically sea otters and whales that hunted almost to extinction in the first half of the 19th century. So I guess environmental factors and non-human environmental factors is one of the main things that pulled me into you know, serious scholarship on the Pacific Ocean.
Thank you. And I saw Alex, you had your hand up, please.
Yes, thank you. The non-human goes to the massive question of currents, ocean currents and winds that define what was the itinerary of slave ships from Africa to the South Atlantic and the North Atlantic. And these itineraries are very different in the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic, to the very peculiarities of the vegetable and the animals. Just to give you a small recent example, in the Slave Voyages website, we have a user email that users, when they have doubts, questions, blah, 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 they send an emails to us and ask people in the back end, either they are specialists in the United States, Western Europe, Latin America, Angola, you name it, someone replies. And we receive a question from someone working on golf courses in South Carolina. You heard that, golf courses in South Carolina, asking us if a specific type of grass in those golf courses that was coming from Africa was brought by enslaved Africans into South Carolina, which, by the way, Charleston is the largest slave trading port of people arriving from Africa to what became the United States. So it was something that was related indeed to the history of South Carolina.
We'll go now to Angela, who'd like to comment on this question as well.
Yeah, thank you to whomever raised that question. This is actually a subject that I'm really quite passionate about, and an area that I think folks really should be looking to Indigenous people to understand a different way of thinking about the environment and thinking about humans as a part of the environment and thinking about how we're in relationship with place as opposed to having dominion over it. I think that the way in which people think about and study the environment is very much rooted in a white supremacist settler colonial paradigm. And I think we can talk specifically like about the ocean, and myself as an Indigenous person from a coastal nation. For us, the creatures in the ocean are relatives. They're family members, and so we can't talk about Acjachemen history and culture without talking about animals, and particularly ocean animals, in the context of that conversation. We have whole protocols around, for instance, if we see whales. Historically, there were a series of songs that we were supposed to sing to our whale relatives. And I think that this whole conversation in environmental studies around the Anthropocene and decolonizing the Anthropocene, again, there's a lot of value in looking to Indigenous worldviews to understand and appreciate a different way of thinking about humans and our relationship with other entities on this planet and with the planet itself.
Thank you, Angela.
I can jump in really quick if that's okay.
Please.
I was just going to say that I kind of gave you the Paul Gilroyan version of the Indian Ocean as Black Atlantic in terms of contact zone, but I didn't get to mention, of course, the Indian Ocean slave trade, and I think that's really important to bring up also in the context of talking about transatlantic slavery. But just the idea that both the Dao culture, right, that I was talking about in the Indian Ocean world, as well as this very old Indian Ocean slave trade from Africa to the Persian Gulf and South Asia, these were absolutely happening in relation to climactic seasons and the circulation of ships according to the environment, right? There's no other way that it happened. But what I'm interested in is the transformation that happened with the onset of Portuguese and then British imperialism in the Indian Ocean. There's really interesting new work emerging on this idea that there are these coexisting temporalities. So this idea of Swahili or Arbi time that was based on the environment and the climate, right, could coexist with these sort of teleological, developmentalist, colonialist, progressive temporalities. And so when for example, Punjabi Sikhs were recruited to build the East African Railway that went from Mombasa to Kampala, right, to Lake Victoria. They were described by colonial officers as building a wedge into the heart of Africa. And so this railway kind of symbolized this taming of inner Africa, including the taming and civilizing of indigenous Africans, but also the natural landscape, right? And so all of this panic over the lions of Tsavo and in Mombasa and Kenya, and needing to kind of conquer nature, right, was such a part of that kind of that the imperialist endeavors of the East African territorial context. But we can still think about them as like sedimented in relation to these Indian Ocean temporalities, which are very tied to nature and climate and the environment.
Thank you. Lyle, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to this topic?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question to ask about something like the 16th century. One thing that I can say is that in the 16th century, the oceans and earth are understood to basically be animated, right? So there is this, there is actually a sense, you know, that all things have some kind of organic origin, right? Many theories, for instance, about the way in which rocks grow are based on this kind of idea of an organic conception of growth. So, I mean, the human and the non-human in that kind of context is a really interesting issue to bring up, because the concept of something that is squarely and only human in a alchemical or what we would call a kind of early modern scientific perspective, actually, those distinctions don't necessarily always hold, given the, you know, depending on the kind of sort of perspective in literature or art that is actually being focused on. So, I mean, it's not, anyway, in terms of the images that I just showed, something like coral is understood in some senses to be an organic kind of formation that's a result of blood hitting the ocean, right? So there's a kind of mutability of substances that is very much a part of 16th century understandings of something like oceans and earth.
Thank you, Lyle. We have one more question from the audience, and I think it'll probably need to be our last one as we're getting close to the end of our time. This audience member was asking if you had any observations on the current, the contemporary Belt and Road Initiative. The questioner notes that it follows Zheng Himing's dynasty journeys, but with a contemporary instance different in the sense of a new form of colonialism. Any comments on that particular instance of these transnational trajectories? I'm guessing maybe that falls outside of your areas of expertise, so fair enough. Lots of comments for thanks for your wonderful presentations. I want to thank Alex, David, Anith, Lyle, and Angela. I want to take the last couple of moments in our program to do something that Judy has asked me to do, which is a few very important announcements, a couple of civic announcements. First of all, to remind people that the US Census is a very important thing. It's there are those who are trying to shut it down prematurely. So we're asking everybody who to attend to completing the US Census, to encouraging their students to do so, and people that they're in contact with in their community. And we're going to be okay. We've got that that link posted there. Second. We have an election coming up, so please register to vote and go and vote or send in your mail-in ballot, and we've got that link up there as well. And then a couple things in terms of our future programs associated with this series and with the Humanities Center. We have the Stories from the Sea Fall Speaker Series to be launched next week. This is a collaboration of the UCI Humanities Center, the UCI Libraries, and the Literary Journalism Program, training UCI undergraduate students to conduct interviews with community members that we'll be showcasing. So we've got that link there in the chat. And lastly, the very impressive set of programs that we have associated with the 1619 project. David was talking about himself and many other people across the campus teaching that very important project. That kicks off next Thursday at 5 p.m. and we have that up there. So with those announcements, I want to really thank again our panelists. I want to thank Angela, Lorelei, Judy Wu for putting this together, our fabulous library and Humanities Center staff that have made this event and our exhibition and our ongoing partnership across the campus possible today. So thank you all.